Welcome to Perspectives, a podcast from Zeit Contemporary Art, exploring art and its ideas. I'm your host, Samuel Shapiro. Throughout the 20th century, abstract painting often served as a device with which artists could open a door by closing one. In 1921, Alexander Rodchenko painted a triptych of monochromes titled Pure Color, Red, Yellow, Blue. Here's what he said about it. I reduced painting to its logical conclusion and exhibited 3 canvases, red, blue, and yellow. I affirmed, this is the end of painting. There will be no more representation. And on he went to work in the service of a socialist utopia. After the cataclysmic historical rupture of the Second World War, Jackson Pollock declared that the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or of any other past culture. Closing the door on easel painting, he proceeded to fling skeins of paint onto prone canvas. In the final quarter of the century, following the hegemony of abstract expressionism like Pollock's, artists turned abstraction on itself. Gerhard Richter claimed his version to be, quote, an assault on the falsity and the religiosity of the way people glorified abstraction with such phony reverence. He called abstraction devotional art and church handicrafts, thus closing the door on utopian aspiration and direct expression in order to open one onto the complex negotiation of history, form, and subjective experience that abstracted painters must perform to this day. Painting has emerged from these polemical positions with ongoing vitality and relevance. Artists now look for new ways forward, both seeking new doors and propping open a few doors that had been, supposedly, slammed shut. But what does it feel like, from their perspective, to work under the weight of this tradition? Which histories of abstract painting, for the potted one I just gave is certainly not the only version of the story, should artists articulate today? What possibilities does the medium of painting and the mode of abstraction offer artists today that it didn't throughout the 20th century? And at a cultural moment in which everything from money to individual identity has been subjected to complex processes of abstraction, can abstract painting still claim to clarify the world around us in our relationship to it? Should it? To begin this conversation, I'm speaking today with 2 young abstract painters, Alteronce Gumby and Julia Rooney. Gumby has degrees in painting from Hunter College and the Yale School of Art, and he's had residencies and solo exhibitions from New York to Paris. Rooney also attended the Yale School of Art after she completed her bachelor's at Harvard. She's exhibited at numerous galleries, has upcoming residencies at Mass MoCA and the Joan Mitchell Center, and has worked as an arts educator at the Sol LeWitt Archive and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This episode, our conversation, is presented in conjunction with Zeit Contemporary Art's viewing room, Painting Abstraction, 1970X to today, which runs online through March 31st. Alteronce and Julia, welcome to Perspectives.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So I began the introduction with Rodchenko's declaration of the end of painting. That was a century ago, and yet here you both are painting. Can I ask both of you to share a time when you were told that painting is dead, and how did you respond?
I feel like that sigh says it all.
It's funny because I was just thinking about the time I read painting's dead or the end of painting. It's really crazy to me that people keep trying to kill painting. And I'm like, why? Like, let's kill something else like racism or bigotry or oppression or, monopoly or capitalism or something. But of course, hearing or reading these things as a student in like a art theory class, I think in a way it was just to give myself and maybe my other cohort, people in my cohort, just fuel for the fire to just in a way find a way to like reinvent painting for ourselves and to try to not even that it needed reviving, but in some way make it fresh for us. I never really got like painting is dead or the end of painting, because obviously later that day someone made a painting, so it's like, are we serious? Like, come on.
I respond to everything you said, and I think it has a lot to do with the sort of philosophy of whatever structured program you're in. And that's not just a school thing. I mean, that can be a group of your peers, that can be an institution that you're affiliated with. In my case, I would say undergrad, there was a pretty strong bent on conceptual work. And I think that had something to do with it being an academic space that language sort of needed to foreground everything. I think a painting, at least in my experience of making it, is something that I discover as I'm doing it. And it often ends up in a pretty far away place from where I started. And that doesn't really fit very neatly within academic proposals, theses, hypotheses that are proved. And I came from a kind of academic environment where all of those things were sort of privileged. So paintings really never fit neatly within that. And it was a struggle to sort of defend the alchemy that is making a painting.
Understanding that painting is clearly not dead, I still just want to push on the experience of painting in the wake of the 20th century. To what extent, if at all, does the tradition of abstract painting, with its successive foreclosures of styles and techniques, weigh on you? Do any practices seem invalidated to you, or do you feel entitled to all of the tools in a painter's toolkit?
I'll say, I think that there are certain narratives around how various schools of abstraction came about. I think there are certain narratives that do feel outdated to me. And what I mean by that is not that the painters themselves are not relevant or that they're not, available for us to participate in some way with. But I think that the art historians that perhaps created those narratives around that work, I think that art historians sometimes can place language almost preemptively on the work, and that language sticks around. But that's maybe the thing that we have to start to think twice about. The paintings, I think they keep giving and giving and giving and giving. So it's really the history that I think has to be revised in some way. Yeah.
I feel like as an art student, you should look at everything. I don't think you should neglect any movement, any artist, any genre, any geographical movement. I mean, there are many art worlds out there, and there are many art histories, and the history that we are given in undergrad or graduate is from a very specific perspective. And I feel like it didn't hit me until actually I got to grad school, and after that, I started noticing that the art history that I was learning um, was never like was not the full scope, was not the full perspective. They teach you about abstract expressionism and all these very maybe Eurocentric American related movements, but there were also abstraction happening in the Middle East. There was also abstraction happening in Africa. There is, modernism abstraction was also happening in Brazil, and Central America, South America, Australia. So, Southeast Asia. I feel like all of these places yield some bit of history and are approaching maybe certain aesthetics and styles differently. I think as an artist, you have to decide what you want from that. What bits and pieces are you taking from that to bring into your own kind of catalog or aesthetic or language, and how is it used and developed in your own work?
I just want to second that and to say that um, the academic model is often very limited by who you're with at this certain moment, who are your professors, who are the critics they're bringing in. And one of the things I really appreciated sometimes was students calling upon other departments outside of the School of Art, and I'm talking specifically about at Yale, and having those voices in the room, because they understand entire histories that are not necessarily part of the art schools uh, alphabet of, references, for instance. And in my own life, I feel like I've learned as much from jobs that I've had working in museums and working in spaces outside of, my own studio and academia about references and sources as any place. So I totally agree about that idea that you should be looking at everything and that everything is sort of available as a source and as a form of research.
Yeah, thank you both. I think that's actually really helpful and hopeful, the ways that you both point out that there are more histories than we've previously explored that can be explored, and that even within the well-trodden histories, artworks can be recovered and new things can be seen in them, that we can keep looking towards Kenneth Nolan or Helen Frankenthaler outside of the context of Clement Greenberg, that their works give to us in new and different ways going forward. Do you feel that you have to commit to a particular approach or position when you're in your studio? Do you feel that you have to put forward one notion of your painting with a specific philosophical parameter, or do you feel that that position can be open and changing every day?
I feel I am an abstract painter. I do know that. I do know I love abstract painting. And I do recognize that I'm engaging in the history of color-filled painting and monochromatic painting and maybe abstract expressionism, um, and all these alternative mediums. But at the same time, I'm trying to create a space for myself to think and develop. I always say that I try to approach my studio practice almost like a mad scientist. Like I know the rules and I understand like I can put this with that and I'll get that. But what if I took this other thing and added it in? And what would I get? Would I create like a monster, a new monster, or would I create something that could be offered as a better solution to a bigger problem? I'm comfortable with either. Um, it's just a matter of which one comes first or comes out of that equation or that formula I'm trying to put together.
One approach shared by both of your practices is a reliance on materials to convey meaning. Can I ask you both to share an example of a particularly meaningful material that you've incorporated into your paintings?
For me, I'll say material is huge. I think material is often where my work starts. I am a painter, but I would say in a lot of respects, my work always starts with a process of collecting things that have no immediate relationship to making a painting, such as a textile that has some kind of previous history of use. It perhaps has staining or tears or things that sort of uh, record a previous life. So for me, material is always the starting point. It always grounds the work, and the imagery that comes about always comes directly from whatever material I'm using.
I guess I'm materialist as well. I feel like I'm constantly trying to explore new materials or I guess new pigments to play with. Or I guess yeah, new ways of applying pigments. Now in my current work, my interest in I guess astrology or astrophysics or geology and mineralogy and the history of pigment and the history of man is kind of all being formulated into this materials that I'm using, which are actually uh, gemstones. I guess one example is that in the painting that's in the show, there's actually raw lapis lazuli embedded in the painting, um, which is actually one of the first minerals that man used, crushed up to turn into pigment, which we know now as ultramarine blue. For me, it just makes it all very dense and full and rich, and that that even the history, or even the time it takes for lapis to be formed within the surface of the earth is also very fascinating to me. Um, I feel like people walk down the street, or we're out in nature and we just see rocks, and we kick them, we throw them. When we're kids, we pick them up, we skip them across the pond. But if you think about the time that it took to make that stone, or that mineral, um, it's probably like hundreds, if not thousands of years old. I mean, the rock that we're standing on, that we call home, is hundreds of millions of years old. And that's just fascinating to me.
Can I respond to something in that it made me think a lot about, and I think especially in your work, Alteronce, seeing it, that it's this idea that blue has all of these, blue in the form of oil paint is so different than blue in the form of a stone, is so different than blue in the form of house paint, and
Mhm.
that all of these kind of different points of development that the color arrives at, like house paint has a different viscosity, it has a different luminosity, it's opaque,
Mhm.
and that isn't something that that has meaning in it, that that like and also that your work also can't really be photographed and reflect the full breadth of what it is, because there is a kind of built-in sheen to it,
Yeah.
right? And there's a material that, like, when it's photographed, you just don't get that kind of like glistening quality. um
Yeah, I think the paintings, yeah, I kind of like that they're hard to photograph.
yeah, yeah,
Because I feel like nowadays people are so used to seeing paintings or images digitally on their phone, on their
right.
computer. And for me, I guess I'm kind of analog with it. Like, I like seeing paintings in person. I go to the MoMA, every Monday, just to sit in front of the Pollock and Newman, and to just look, because I feel like there's more information there, and the physical marks, um, than I'd ever get from looking at an image. So I feel like I kind of really load that in on my paintings, that I'm kind of really into the physicality of a painting, that this is a thing, it's here, it's made by man. And it needs to be seen in person. I think anyone who's been to the Pantheon in Rome, or seen the Eiffel Tower in Paris, there's certain seeing a postcard of the Eiffel Tower, or the Empire State Building, or even New York City. We just say Chinatown. Seeing a postcard of Chinatown is much different than standing on Mott Street and Canal. You know what I mean? Like, there's a smell, there's a sensation that you're getting, there's noises. And I feel like kind of paintings have that same, attribute. They need to be seen in person. They need to be felt or touched, and experienced. And so I think that's something with my work that I really try to. I feel like I almost do it on purpose, to be honest. In the back of my,
Totally. Yeah, I think it's a strategy. I mean, I feel the same way about it. And you mentioned all these other senses when it comes to a place, but I think with painting, it's, for me, it's something having to do with scale, and
hmm
having to do with
hmm
an awareness of how big my body is in relationship to this thing before me. And I think of scale just as much of a formal tool as I do color. And that is why it's so important to me that my work is seen in person, because scale is an arbitrary factor when it's reproduced on a screen, and it often ends up becoming dictated by the architecture of the screen, right? So you see it on a phone and it's 2 inches, you see it on a
hmm
computer screen and it becomes this kind of horizontal
hmm
um, thing. And scale, I have always thought of as one of the most integral things that creates meaning in how work is experienced. And I think similarly, you mentioned the Pantheon, that has a lot to do with my relationship to painting in the context of architectural space, and historically painting existing in sites, spiritual and religious sites, where the placement of a painting above one's head was embedded in the meaning and embedded in the way the artist actually created the work with regard to perspective, for instance. And I think a lot of work has been removed from that embeddedness in a site now that we can sort of see paintings or art anywhere, right? We can see it on our phone as we move from place to place. And there's a huge gap that happens when work is removed from its original site.
You both mentioned the resistance to photographic duplication and dissemination as a strategy, and I'm totally with you there. It's nearly impossible to see like the work of Robert Ryman or Eve Klein in reproduction. But especially today, in the midst of COVID, that's not always an option, I would think, for contemporary painters. And I know that you both do contend with the processes of digitalization and virtualization and algorithmic serialization that define our relationship to the visual online. So given that necessity, how do you factor the inevitable internetification of your paintings into the process of their making?
Well, I'll start by saying I have never had an Instagram account for the very reason that we're talking about. That scale is so important to me, and I never wanted my work to be reduced to the size of a screen, a phone screen specifically. And I have a show up right now that it consists of entirely 2-inch by 2-inch paintings, which I made site specifically for the phone screen, knowing that one of the sites that the work would be experienced in would be Instagram, and one of the sites would be the physical space of the gallery. So in my sort of resistance to the digitization of my work, I made work that was almost meant to be digitized. So in a way, I feel like I'm kind of giving into this trend, but at the same time critiquing it by using its own form as a kind of language. And part of my hope is that there is a really distinct moment where someone sees it in person and realizes that 2 inches is really, really small. And you never realize that when it's on your phone, because that's sort of the given, right? It's this given architecture that we take for granted, or that we don't think about being made, really, you know? And the work is still, I think on Instagram it looks a certain way, and it kind of looks good, quote unquote, you might say, but it's so far from what the work really is. But it is a way that I know the world will experience it. And I'm kind of playing with that by saying, okay, I will play this game, but I will play it on sort of my own terms. And it's the first time I think I've made something that is that this directly engages with that kind of digital space, and kind of, again, gives into it, but at the same time sort of holds its ground as something different from it.
Julie, I love that you're making you made like 2-inch paintings specifically for people to photograph on Instagram, so that they kind of realize, like, this is what you're trying to diminish my work too. So
Right.
I'm gonna just give it to you.
Right.
And
This is how ridiculous it is.
it is so yeah.
This is where we've gotten to.
This is where we got. It's so true. It's so true. Yeah, I feel like I do have an Instagram account, and I feel like I use images of my work. I used to get really annoyed. Maybe about 3 years ago, I would just be, photographers would come over and document my work, and they send me these images to prove. And there were times where I would just really just get frustrated, and I'm like, oh, but you're missing it. You're not getting this tone, you're not getting that tone, because I work a lot with iridescent pigments. So depending on the conditions of the light and where the viewer is standing in front of the work, the colors shift slightly. So for me, that is all a part of experiencing the work. And Julia mentioned earlier that scale plays a huge factor in how paintings are experienced, and I think that that's totally true, as well as the atmosphere that you're in, the way it's lit, the way the colors are kind of coming together within your own eyes. That mixture of light in the back of your retinas is different than when it is when you're staring at a computer screen or a cell phone. So, but I always try to encourage people, to go to the museums, go to the galleries, actually look at the work in person.
Can I ask you something? And I'm curious because you talked so much about being frustrated with photographers taking these pictures of your work. Have you ever, or do you ever take photos of the work from angles that purposefully don't allow one to think that they saw the work, so you take it from the side and then you have this light reflecting off, or you see the edge of the canvas, or you see the kind of the stone coming off, which is in a way thinking about painting closer to sculpture, where that's inherent in one's understanding of a photograph. Everyone seems to know that a sculpture photographed is different than it is in person, but somehow with painters, people are like, oh no, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And painting is a flat medium, and so it is especially susceptible to this flattening that happens on the screen. And I almost wish that we would treat painting more like sculpture, and just say, no, like here's an angle of it, and
Right.
you got to see it again, or you got to take a video of it as you walk by.
I remember sitting in Art History 101, and they put up the slides of Pollock #1 or Barnett Newman, or even Woman in a Hat, Matisse, and you see all these things, and you're just looking at a slide projection in class. So the scale, is, and resolution, you know what I mean? Depending on what school you went to, how good those projectors were, says a lot. Like when I was in San Francisco and I saw Woman in a Hat by Matisse, I was like, oh my God, like this is there's much more going on than I've ever seen in this, image and Gardner Art Through the Ages. It's like it's almost not even fair to talk about art in this way. I encourage any art history professor, after we're back to some new sense of normacy, to make sure that you take your class to an art gallery or art museum to actually see art in person, rather than just giving them a PowerPoint slide presentation, because it does so much more for the students to actually see work in person. And a few professors did that for me when I was an undergrad, and I think it just got me even more hooked on art. Now, I don't know if it would have been the same if I had just was looking at images on a slide projector.
Yeah, my version of that like shock moment was when I first saw Eva Hesse's Hang Up, which is just so much bigger than I ever imagined.
Right.
And it was just shocking. And this was recent. This was like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And I wasn't I was even surprised to see it. I was like, I had no idea this was even here.
Right.
So
Right.
It is amazing the way that painting sculpture just consumes space, and you understand why they position it against the window in Chicago, because it can't play with anything. Right? It devours.
Right.
Picking up on your last question, Julia, how do you think about the relationship of your work to the sculptural and the architectural generally?
They're completely related. I would say 2 to 3 years ago is the first time I really started bringing paintings off the wall. I was making these freestanding double-sided paintings that were made with, in some cases, transparent and in others translucent material. I was using spandex stretched on these frames that when they stretched really, really tightly, they became these translucent screens, literally and sort of figuratively. And I was also using clear glass embedded within these sort of these hanging screens. And the clear glass was a way to, again, literally allow for transparency in the work. I mean, I think I want to have my cake and eat it too. Like, I want the paint to be an image, and I also want the painting to be an object. And I think, again, that comes from just my deep, a lot of time that I spent looking at paintings that were made for specific architectures, the history of fresco being this incredible example of the imageness of the painting and then the objectness of the painting. And neither of those things were prioritized over the other. They felt like they were both important in how the artist created the work. And I want that now.
Alteronce, you spoke about the way that your paintings function in relief and how they demand to be seen from multiple perspectives too. But your shaped canvases also interact in interesting ways with their architectural containers. How do you think about hanging your work in relationship to the architecture in which it's shown?
My shaped paintings, the moonwalkers, that really came from I guess a fascination for the history of shape paintings and abstraction. But then also it kind of happened just by chance. I was working on a body of work where I was kind of making these motif paintings that were kind of like Tetris-like shape paintings from a long gallery from 2017. And I kind of I got this new studio here in the Bronx, and it was a huge open space, and I wanted to make a much larger version of that painting, of like a Tetris-like shape painting. And I kind of put some canvases together, and it was like 48 by 48 square um, feet panels, and kind of mended them together on the floor. When I sat it up, it was on this angle. It was 9 feet high, and my ceilings are only 10 feet high. So there was no way it was going to kick up on the wall the way I intended it. And I kind of stepped back and saw this painting. It was really just smitten by it, and was really just mesmerized by it. I never seen a shape like that before, or a painting like that before. I really tried hard to think. I kind of just went with it. It wasn't really something that I really set out or intended to do. Um, but it felt new and fresh to me, and it felt like something that I wanted to get to understand. So I kept it, and I kept, working it and reworking it, and eventually, having, panels made specifically to rest on the wall this way. And, it's funny because people come to me and are like, oh, Alteronce, what if you turned it this way or turned it that way? And I'm like, no, no, it's good. Let's let's leave it how it is. And but there's something, I don't know, something new and refreshing about it, and now it's kind of becoming a little bit of a signature style for me. But I kind of think of the artists like in the show, like Gerhard Richter, or Helen Frankenthaler. I feel like I'm like sitting at the table now and having a conversation with them about this, and it feels good. It feels earnest. And I'm actually looking to develop and find new shapes that I could, or create new spaceships that I can kind of conjure and see where they take me as well.
That's great. Your works in very different ways present a notion of the handmade. Alteronce, many of your paintings recall the process of hand placing tesserae in a mosaic. Julia, your paintings often exhibit the results of a manual process, whether that be pulping or stretching or stitching, that all carry a handmade quality. We talked about digitization and virtualization, but what for you guys is the significance of the artist's hand in 2021?
Everything. I mean, gosh, the hand, I hope the same way that painting never dies, the hand never dies. I mean, it's really important to me that that is something that happens by my own application. And I think part of that is that uh, there's always the potential for error and for accident. And a lot of my best moments, I think, come from noticing the accident and going with it and saying, oh, like that's more interesting than what I thought I was doing. Right. And if you're not there to catch the accident because you didn't make it, then that potential is gone. And so in a lot of ways, I think being a painter is about noticing things, not even acting on them right away, but just noticing that they happened and living with them and looking at them and letting time do its work, and then eventually catching them. Like you're the sieve and some things come through the sieve, some things pass through the sieve and other things stick in the sieve, and then you as the artist are kind of picking through the pebbles that have stuck in the sieve. And for me, that is what the process of the hand is. It's like your decision to pick through the pebbles of of uh of a process and decide what you are going to go with and turn into something else.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. You gotta love human error. I feel like it was probably human error why most of us are here, you know? So I think that some people who want like those perfect paintings or images, or there's certain artists who really like the digital age and are printing images down, and that's okay. That's their thing. I think, me personally, I relate more to the human touch, and I like the errors, I like the mistakes. I think it's one of the reasons I like jazz music. It's like they're kind of just throwing notes in there, but if you ever talk to a musician or actually went and saw and heard jazz music, that they know all the scales out there. They probably know hundreds of scales, and they're kind of mixing it all together in a way that's very humane, and they're thinking while they're doing it. So I think when sometimes when I look at my own paintings, I look at other people's paintings, I like watching the thinking process happening and being recorded in the object that they made. So it's a very unique thing. I think it's a very human thing to appreciate, the handmade over the machine made.
I want to ask you both about the politics of abstraction and your abstractions in particular. Abstraction, in many ways, is a defining feature of our society. The 2008 financial crisis, for example, was predicated on the process of turning tangible assets into derivatives, which is a process of abstraction. And in a very different but equally important manner, our discourse around identity has witnessed the abstraction of individual identity from the physical body towards notions of identification and fluidity, notions that rely on an understanding of identity as a set of constructs and ideas or abstractions. How does your process of painterly abstraction relate or intervene in the forms of social, economic, and political abstraction that shape the way we live?
Well, I felt like when I started researching the history of monochromatic painting, the one of the first images I came across, or I guess one of the earliest images of, or is deemed to be one of the first abstract paintings, is the image by Paul Billot from the 19th century, of which is a black square framed with a caption underneath in French, Negroes fighting in a tunnel at night. And I felt like, I already knew that politics was already infused in art. I feel like it's already a very radical or political statement to even just be an artist in society. But there was something about, especially me being a person of color, a black man, that I was kind of born into a society where politics or social politics was already kind of betted against me, and seeing it being kind of reinforced or elaborated in very subtle notions of color and abstraction, I started to kind of I thought to myself, as a huge fan of abstract painting, that this is something I would like to take on and kind of challenge for myself. So I think I started really thinking about the ways and the history in which color has been used and defined within society, especially in its relationship to race, and the Jim Crow era here in America of, either blacks and whites and everyone in between, that this association with color and identity has been really, an oppressive, color has been weaponized or radicalized by human beings. And I feel like within my process, I of abstract painting, I kind of want to emancipate or liberate color for myself. Um, I feel like there's so many associations or ways in which one can think about the color black or the color blue or the color red. I feel like in in my work, I kind of wanted to consider all those things, but then hopefully through the process of painting, um, almost erase or expand the notion or the universe or definitions of those terms even further to really stretch them. So I feel like uh, abstraction for me has really allowed my mind to kind of let go or wander or decompose or de-stress these things that are kind of like imposed upon my consciousness, um either through social politics or other things that are kind of affecting me.
I think abstraction does something that poetry does in the way that it gives us things we can recognize, i.e., words, and it orients them in such a way that you end up with a taste, but it doesn't define itself. When you read a poem, I think the best poems leave you with something that is more open than closed. And that's not to say that they aren't direct or that they skirt away from hard issues. It's to say that they give you enough, but they don't tell you what you should believe necessarily. They leave you with a kind of question mark. They open some kind of door that you can walk through, or you can not walk through, or you can look at, you can engage with. And for me, abstraction doesn't come from nowhere. Abstraction comes from everything in the world. I think that my forms come from things that I have seen or things that I have somehow absorbed over the course of my existence, but they don't need to end there. They possibly start there in a way that may or may not be relevant to my viewers, but they end somewhere else. And abstraction is actually very, I don't want to say it's literal, but it is what it is. It's a very, in a way for me, very honest form of depositing a mark, because it doesn't aspire to be something else. It doesn't say this is going to be a likeness of something else. And in that, it is exactly what it is. And it comes from someplace else, and it's associative and it's evocative, and it can conjure up all kinds of meaning for whoever is seeing it, but it doesn't demand to be read in a certain way.
Selfishly, while I have two painters as a captive audience, who are you guys looking at? Where do you see the most exciting work around being made?
Well, I will just say one thing. The last show that I saw that's like really strongly in my memory was the Donald Judge show at MoMA, and I think, well, first of all, I should say I saw it in a relatively empty gallery, which is like unheard of. You know, if you had seen that in like normal times, you would have basically been experiencing 50% people and then like 20% art. And then, so it was like I got to be in a huge room with these objects that you could actually see your own reflection in. You could see the work reflecting in the work itself, the surfaces. And I think that his sort of early dance with painting and then sort of departure into the world of sculpture is something I really relate to. But I think actually that some of the best work that or like the most exciting work is like just my friends' studios and like seeing it being made and seeing the stuff that they wouldn't necessarily, you know, ever exhibit, but that they're in the process of making. And I miss doing studio visits. I feel like that's been really hard during the pandemic. And the few in-person studio visits I've had have just given me a lot of energy.
One of the, I think, best shows that I've seen that really inspired me was Howardina Pendo at the Shed right now. Um, Fire, Water, Rope, I believe it's called, which is really a great show. I think for me, she's really doing a lot materially. You know, she's pushing herself even as an artist. I don't like late career, but I'm gonna say mid career for Howardina. Even as an artist mid career as Howardina, um, it's really refreshing to see her taking risk as she is still doing it. You know, and I love seeing artists. Even the Sam Gilliam show
Mm,
at Pace
yeah.
was like, my God, it's like. Um, seeing, I guess, artists who have been working for a while, still taking a lot of risk in their work and still trying to explore, still uh, uh, searching is something that I'm really excited about, and it gives me a lot of hope and um, admiration to just go in my studio and to keep playing, keep exploring. um, yeah, I feel like I wish because of COVID, I haven't been doing a lot of studio visits. I kind of just keep up with what's going on, around town via trying to see shows. But yeah, I think those two shows really did it for me this past fall and winter. Um, and then also, I guess, I mean, it's probably shameless to say, or very much of an artist of me, but I'm really excited what's going on in my studio. I'm like, I go in my studio and I'm like, oh, this is so exciting. Like, I think it's okay if you're an artist to have that feeling or vibe. You know what I mean? Like, I think we all should be excited to just wake up and just can't wait to get in our studios. And I sometimes I feel a little guilty when like I'm on the phone with a friend or my mom and I'm like, Mom, I gotta go, like someone's on the other line. No one's really on the other line. I just want to like get to my paintings. And um but I'm just that engaged in the studio.
The paintings are on the other line.
Yeah, paintings are another line, Mom. Like I gotta. I'm caught up on the family gossip. Now let me.
Yeah.
let me get to work. But yeah, I hope every artist has that. If you don't have it, you should strive for that. You should want to wake up and just want to run to the studio, or it gets so late that you're not you don't want to leave. And I think that's just I guess a part of it, having a good work ethic, and making sure that you're feeding your studio practice mentally, as much as you're kind of feeding other aspects in your life. And yeah, like I feel like me and Julie are talking about going out and seeing shows and having that experience and bringing little tidbits back to the studio, back to the work. and seeing if it works or doesn't work. And yeah.
I think the Painting's Calling is a great place to bring this to an end. So, Alteronce,
Let's do a studio visit.
Yeah, Julie, anytime.
Yeah,
Sam, likewise. You guys are more than welcome to come by.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you both for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been great to talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Perspectives, a podcast from Zeit Contemporary Art. I'm your host, Samuel Shapiro.